Thank you, and welcome to the Akron Public Schools Finance Committee meeting on November 3rd, 2022. Thank you, and welcome to those who might be listening in. And at this time, we will turn it over to our treasurer.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, we've got about an hour, depending on Q&A. We've got Andrew Pizzullo here to join us in the conversation to help run some slide deck. Tonight's more conversation for the board. And as you know, we're going to pass a 5-year forecast in the month of November and May. ODE did change it from October and May to November. I think that was more to align closer to election season to give boards more accurate information around that time. And we also wanted to visit this in the first board meeting of November because we have some other timely discussions and decisions to make upcoming that are going to impact our negotiated agreements. So wanted to take the opportunity to get a couple times in front of the board. And as you guys know how I like to work, you're going to help make the presentation for Monday. So your feedback and questions are appreciated because we can, zero in on something, add, subtract to make it more relevant. Okay. With that, Pete, in the booth, we're going to start showing here. And I did talk to the superintendent. She was going to join today via call, so I'm not sure if she's able to chime in or she can message one of us if she has some questions. Or, Madam Superintendent, if you are listening and you want to call, I will put you on microphone. That'd be great. All right, so our theme for the 5-year forecast is the post-pandemic reality. So post-pandemic, we're starting to really see true data return to our spending trends, our revenue trends. There's been so much disruption in school operations, from virtual learning to back in person, to a significant decline of 1-year enrollment to return. And so this post-pandemic reality is going to look very similar to what it was like before we started the pandemic. So both financially, a need for new operating monies. So you'll see this is constructed around those themes. All right, the agenda for tonight on the 5-year forecast is ESSER funds. We're going to really take a deep dive into expenses. We'll finish a little bit on revenue side because we do know folks are looking at their property tax bills with reappraisals and increased home values, inflation. They're asking questions, but we want to give you some reality about what revenue really looks like for that. But we'll spend most of our time on expenses. Now, number one thing we want to draw out for everyone's attention as part of a post-pandemic reality, and the board spent a lot of time here over the last few months as it relates to finance for this reason and other reasons. One of the first questions you're going to get asked is how close are we to the May forecast? So we're going to just lead off with that. We're going to show you where we were in May and where we're coming in here in November. Bottom line is we're pretty close. We're within a normal range and reasonable percentage. And when I say post-pandemic reality, this is what it was like before the pandemic. Remember, we went through all those disruptions and swings where I was telling you, I don't know what next year's finances are going to look like because virtual learning may continue. We may use ESSER funds to further rebate operations. So we're now back to some normalcy with our school budget. It's much more predictable. And that first year, the top forecast is May, the bottom forecast is November, so we just have that big red arrow pointed there. We predicted a $113 million balance. That's been reduced slightly to $108 million. That's within a margin of error, frankly, but as you look out to the out years, to fiscal 26, 27, you can really see how tight those numbers are. So to take the end year at the top, the May forecast of Fiscal 26, $63 million carryover to fiscal 26. At the bottom is $57 million. We're really tight.
Hey, Ryan, real
Yeah.
quick. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you just take maybe a minute or two and just kind of refresh the group and anybody who might be listening or watching on, folks who pay close attention probably would have noticed that November of 21 to May of 22, there was a pretty significant difference.
Yep.
Right? I know that some folks have brought up. Can you just talk to sort of why that difference was so large again? Because you make the comment that things are a lot more predictable now. Can you speak to sort of why there was so much variability between what we looked at in November of 21 versus May of 22?
Right. November 21, we presented, we talked about that quite often, about being a charge to the district. And if you remember my forecast presentation, to say we were in transition probably was an understatement. We were working with a new superintendent and a board who was coming out of a response to the pandemic about how to utilize $150 million of ESSER funds. And at the time, our plans were in progress, but they were not solidified. And we said right up front, this forecast is going to look different. It's going to look different for these reasons. And so we showed much more of the ESSER funds coming into, and I would call it rebate, continuity of services, into the forecast, which inflated our cash balance. We knew it wouldn't last. We put that in our forecast notes and our assumptions and our PowerPoint. We own that very publicly. To that, I think that quoted $100 million difference is what's kind of out there right now. And we knew that was more of a transparency effort. It was, you hear me when we say budgetary or forecast, they're often a board's control. Like it's a control aspect too, a level of control. So by issuing that charge to the district, we were saying we need these plans to be solidified. We need to plan them, implement them over the remaining ESSER years, and just as importantly, off-board those expenses and make sure they don't stick around for too long because we wouldn't be able to afford them. So I think the answer to that question will also be clearer as we go on, Dr. Hall, about that $100 million. So I may even include that in Monday's presentation, because we'll bring back the slides from the November 21 forecast.
I think we should. Right?
Okay.
I know that there's been some information put out there, to some of our staff, kind of calling out the $100 million delta, and so I just want to make sure that that folks who've been on the receiving end of some of those materials, that we are make sure that we're that A, we're aware of it, and B, that we're to make sure that we address. So to your point, we've addressed it previously, but we want to make sure that we're addressing it again. To make sure that we address any clarity. So that's part A, and then part B. The other thing I'd like you to address, if not here, we can do it on Monday. But just, I know the other big thing is the fair school funding formula, and so and I know that there's finances. We all know is about what assumptions you're making too, and I think that there are parties that make an assumption that we're going to be on the receiving end of maybe $20 to $30 million in additional
each year.
Right?
Correct.
And so would want to talk through how many years that excess is locked in for, and then beyond what point are we guessing again, or at the mercy of the approval of a biennial budget. So I just want to make sure that we address those two big pieces as well. Because again, I want to make sure that we're using these public meetings to address any mis or disinformation that's out there.
You got it.
So.
Okay. And I'm thinking we have, Andrew, somewhere in our portfolio of slides, we have, when we say the post-pandemic reality, and we're really close, May to November, almost like I'm thinking a bar chart from pre-pandemic to now of estimates. And I think what we can do is we can show that we've trended in really tight range with this disruption of November and have returned right back to where we said we were going to be. So maybe we can make a graphic out of that that's easier to tell a story.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, and then the
Yeah.
third thing as I'm walking through my wish list here, the third thing is that I think we also discussed that we were levy imminent prior to the pandemic, and so I want to make sure that as that third piece that that we're also addressing here. So as the layperson's looking at this slide, why are we again levy imminent?
You got it.
Following the expenditure of the ESSER dollars. And how that impacts levy timing, and sort of what is the idealized version to be thinking about a levy. So those are kind of the three things that, and again, I'm not saying we need to talk through all that today, but as I'm thinking through what we talk about Monday and in subsequent public-facing meetings, we'll make sure that we're being transparent with anybody that's paying attention and watching.
You got
those
it.
three items. So, sorry, Dr. Thompson, you were saying.
Just a question for my edification. So initially that 100 million, before it was determined what it would be spent on, the initial forecasting was that it would offset general fund expenditures.
Correct.
And then it ends up, after it goes through the process, whatever process that was, then it ended up actually not offsetting general fund dollars.
Not as much.
Not as much.
Correct.
So those dollars that didn't end up offsetting general fund dollars, how does that impact the 5-year forecast going forward?
Right. And so the question we hope to answer tonight and Monday is, in fiscal 25 and beyond, how much are we assuming will come back and stay as a part of those new, innovative, or needed programs? And I had a really great conversation today with the superintendent about how those themes are going to resonate through this. So we're going to talk about the assumptions of approximately $10 million in change that will stay as a permanent part of the budget in fiscal 25 and beyond, or what we would like to, right? That's a conversation, board, community, and what we can sustain.
I think that'll help the rumor mill too to understand that.
Yeah. So post-pandemic reality, but we just put this together because it really has framed everything in our own personal daily walk and our professional daily walk. And that's products and services and shortages, which we know that from capital planning and Dr. Thompson's dealing with, to labor shortages and how that impacts the organization, how we plan and spend, whether or not we can spend these ESSER dollars and have enough staffing to fulfill that. Inflation costs, right? We saw what happened with diesel fuel and, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars more expensive than the prior year in diesel fuel. And then the last one is the impact of property. And we're still, we still receive 35%-ish of our revenue from local property, whether it's residents or commercial industrial. And we want to show you what impact that's had on our books and address some misconceptions with property values. So, all right, sticking with the personnel. Employee personnel services, wages, benefits, 60% of our overall budget. In 22 today, 60%. We predict in 27, if we can maintain similar footing out in a few years, maintain that same 60%. You'll see the disruption that COVID had on our operation from 2019 to 2020. Now, it looks pretty subtle there, but that's when the pandemic hit and you see the inflation really stopped right there. It kind of smoothed out, and mostly our hourly, part-time labor cost and transportation costs decline and started to decline, but you see the big drop in 21. And you've seen this story before. 22 and beyond, we're in fiscal 23 right now, and you see that inflation coming back in. And you see in fiscal 25, it's pretty subtle there, but between fiscal 24 and fiscal 25, it's a little bit higher than average jump. And that's, Dr. Thompson, part of those, the themes, the 10 million in new initiatives coming. Superintendent and I themed those today. Instructional supports, safety and security, and whole student supports. And when you really get down to those initiatives that we're planning, whether it be class size reduction, they fit into one of those three categories. And ultimately, you also teed up the question, how can we sustain it? How can we keep it out?
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
Just real quick, because my brain just turned off. So as we were talking through the ask for Monday, one was the $100 million differential question. The third one was the levy timing impact. What was the second one again? I know I asked it, but I'm now blanking on what I.
Fair school
That's
funding.
right. Thank you. I lost the thread. All right.
Can you back up?
Plus
Oh.
we had Dr. Thompson's question
Yeah.
as well. And I'm glad you referenced sustainability because, again, that's something else that, I know that in this committee, I've had a lot of concerns about as well. So.
What does that assume?
Yes, thank you. I was like, go back a slide. Thank you. This assumes 1.75% increases on the base, which is in all forecasts. Each year. Again, let me tell you a little bit about why. I met with a group of Northeastern Ohio treasurers 2 Fridays ago and surveyed the room because I'm like, I want to know what everybody else is doing. And the question was, how many in the room forecast a placeholder?
What was the second thing again?
What?
What was the second thing again? Damn, oh my God. I told you, I've got 2 sick kids, and I'm nursing a really bad headache right now, so I
It's
apologize.
early on in the finance
I
talk, too.
I know,
We can't
I know.
lose you yet.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the question was, how many in the room forecast a placeholder assumption? Half the hands went up. How many in the room forecast a 0? And then we talked for about a half an hour. And so it's about split. Half the districts put a 0 in non-negotiated years, and half the districts put a placeholder somewhere in between 1% and 2%. We had a really robust discussion about the impact on relationships more than anything. So many times a district that doesn't have a consistent approach to a 0 and who really has a transparent understanding with its stakeholders that a 0, and when a settlement's done, it moves numbers, and it moves numbers in a substantial format, and it moves them down. And so when we were having that early conversation before the meeting started about what does 1% do, and it compounds, you can imagine a size of a budget ours has with a 0% and then a negotiated agreement out 3 years. You could move things by tens of millions of dollars, and then if you're not appropriately informing, or sometimes it gets lost in the mix between 2 forecasts submitted a year, your budget can move tens of millions of dollars. Then you start to lose your stakeholders. So I've always been of the philosophy that we have a placeholder that's a starting block. It's a starting block for conversations and really to just scenario for the board. That's what it should be. And then the forecast doesn't move as much over time. So 1.75, and we've been very fortunate in the district to have lower than inflationary moves on medical spend. However, we just had a conversation about an hour ago where our current year claims are way up. And what we expected to happen post-pandemic and post-pandemic reality is right here. It's right. It is showing itself through the data that we're going to have a big inflation year in health insurance. But we've been well below trend. And what I call trend is used to hear, maybe a little less than a decade ago, 8 to 10%, pretty normal. We've been 5% and below, and on the books at 0% a couple years in a row. But it's increasing.
So the 175, can you just expound upon that a bit? So the 175 per year is what we built in for what?
175 is built in for base wage increases for all employees in non-negotiated years. So when we can you back up to the original May versus November slide? this slide. So when you look at expenditures there, the bottom chart, you see the expenditures of $330 million on out in fiscal 23, 24, and 25, and 6 and 7, that assumes 1.75% in the base wage increases.
Gotcha.
Now, that also allows employee indexes and steps to move freely as well. There's no restriction on that. So any change to that, you're going to see a change in that bottom $330 million line starting this year.
Yeah. So obviously that's an assumption we're making here. Would love to see an illustration of what a 3, 4, or 5% would look like as opposed to a 1.75. The reason why I asked the question is because as we're thinking about the levy conversation, again, recall we were levy imminent prior to the pandemic, because I want to understand, and I think it's important for the public to understand too, what kind of levy we would need to pass in order to, for lack of a better term, finance, if you will, base rates that were in the 3, 4, or 5% area. Because I think one of the things I struggle with personally is, in my head, is keeping it straight. So the translation or the conversion from millage to actual dollars to the district, right? So is it 7 mills comes out to roughly $30 million, 7.5 mil comes out to 38. Again, it's that conversion I don't have in my head. And so you mentioned the compounding effects. I'd like to understand here, for example, how base rate increases of 3, 4, or 5%, the compounding effects that we see there, and the impacts it has on revenue surplus or on the revenue surplus or deficit line item there, and then also in combination with the levy talk around. All right, well, hypothetically, we're assuming 1.75. If we're at 3, 4, or 5, here's how the numbers change, and here's the impact on the type and size of levy that we would have to ask for. So I know we've had conversations about permanent improvement versus operating levies, but just from an operating levy standpoint, let's put permanent improvement aside, but just operating levy wise, I want to understand. If we passed a 4% or 5%, for example, base rate increase, like what size of a levy would we have to pass in order to ensure that we were appropriately financing that? Yeah. So those are just things that I think that would be important for us to sort of be able to understand. Okay. Because again, obviously those numbers are the 1.75 is just as you put it is an assumption, so subject obviously to change. Correct. So as we're planning out, I think it's important that we have that conversation too. Yeah.
Just for the record, in today's dollars, 1 mil generates about $3 million.
All right. That's right. 23 million, 24 million for our levy. Depends on what we get, 6.9, 7.9 mils.
So 1 mil, approximately $3 million to the district.
Yes.
After that.
1% is approximately $2 million.
Correct. 1%.
So you can do the math on that number.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Pretty much wipe out that last number for sure.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep. We'll definitely bring those conversion in some illustrations on. Okay.
Okay.
All right, moving on. This was a Beacon article during the pandemic, December of 2020, and this was early on in ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, before we really got a sense of what ESSER 3 was going to bring to our books. And this was just a quote. We were kind of going back because to string through pre-pandemic to now is really difficult for all of our stakeholders. Things have changed so dramatically that we said, do we properly communicate this? And if I had to do anything differently on this quote, I would have said, in a sense, we bought ourselves a couple years. And now the post-pandemic, we're right back where we were pre-pandemic. This is all expenses for general fund. This should give you a really good idea of the pandemic's impact on our spending. And you see the vast majority of our expenses on the left are salaries and benefits. And then you see this purchase service supplies, materials, and other. It also does frame a really interesting conversation for those who are coordinating the board and superintendent, that when you get down to it, the discretion that you have on a budget is really low, right? I mean, the discretionary money that you have is really low. So I think it does address one of those. This, to me, tells a story. It addresses one of those misconceptions that the district is swimming in all kinds of money and it can just do what they want when they want. It really isn't that way. And it's a long-term commitment to students that if you do spend higher than trend, and this inflationary story is going to mean something in a minute, you can really do damage to the district and district finances. So you see very similar to that personnel line item, you see 2019 is business as usual. 2020, you really see the start of the impact, the drop and impact of 21. That's both the use of ESSER funds and a decline in many of the expenses. Probably the biggest one was transportation that wasn't in the books. Fair school funding plan impact, for sure. 22, no, we're in fiscal 23, and Andrew's got that fiscal 25. You see a pretty sizable jump in 24 to 25. I wish I had my pointer, but I really want you to focus on 2018 to fiscal 25 and beyond. And that's the story of inflation. That's the story of business as usual returning back to our operation. And so if that pandemic hadn't hit, where would our spending be? Somewhere around that fiscal 25 mark. And then things really get compounding after that, because we're out of those one-time monies.
So Ryan, so again, from an assumption standpoint, I think it's worthwhile to. So, for example, here we're assuming that we're not spending ESSER dollars on salaries.
We are spending some ESSER monies on salaries, yes.
It was what, about $10 million?
In fiscal 25 and beyond, that was one of my assumption points, is we've got about $10 million baked in of new expenses that were previously covered by ESSER that are remaining in fiscal 25 and beyond. Mm-hmm. It's about $10 million. And the vast majority of that $10 million is personnel. In fiscals 21, 22, 23, and 24, the reason that those bar charts are not up higher, and that because they do represent the majority of our spending, salary and benefits, is because ESSER funds are picking up those personnel. And so you remember in some of our ESSER presentations, we had the spending buckets, where call out a couple of them for me. We just looked at it today.
Expanded learning, after-school, technology supports.
Yep.
Multi-elementary counselors.
Yeah, so in almost every single one of those spending categories, the majority of it is personnel. There's a few options in there in technology where you'd have a whole Chromebook allocation or some other capital outlay, but the majority of it is personnel.
Yeah, so I guess where I was going with it, and I apologize, I wasn't very articulate there, was, again, from an assumption standpoint, our sort of base forecast assumes a 175, right?
Correct.
So we talked about looking at what a 3, 4, or 5 would look like. The other thing that I was also had in my head was, assuming, because we're also, so assuming that we took ESSER dollars, because there are districts across the country that have used ESSER dollars as a one-time bonus for, for teachers, right? So just to really, as a way of saying thank you, and we understand that the life has been tough in the classrooms and in teaching online, things like that. But these numbers here don't reflect any assumptions about any sort of one-time bonuses being paid out of ESSER dollars. I guess that's, I
They do
guess that's
not.
my, okay.
No,
Okay.
they do not. And nor can we use the ESSER dollars to commit to a permanent fixture.
Correct.
Right? So,
That's right.
And that's not reflected in that either.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no other assumptions other than a 1.75 and for the steps and indexes to move freely.
Okay, gotcha. Okay.
Quantify as well. Okay. Andrew, you want to walk us through that? You added that in today. It really
Yeah.
shows a big impact.
So in 2018, 19, and 20, you could see as we continued to see our inflationary increases in supplies and materials, as soon as the pandemic hit, in 2020, we had some immediate one-time expenditures of some cleaning supplies, sanitation supplies, and then as soon as 21 came around, all of those expenditures went to ESSER. 21 through 24, all of those cleaning supplies, science materials, specialty materials, those are being funded out of ESSER through the ESSER plan. Fast forward to 25, ESSER is now gone, and we return straight to that inflationary increase back to where we were before. If you could draw a line from 2020 to 2025, you would see that same increase as you can see it out through 27. I think this shows a really kind of like a good story of how we use those ESSER funds to support our initiatives during COVID.
Good, thanks.
So Ryan, is there, just so again, I don't want to get the cart in front of the horse here. Is there a slide here that you have in your deck that's going to, that's more of a capital expenditure slide?
No, because
Okay.
general fund, well,
Well, here's what I'm asking,
we
right?
have
So,
we have a slide coming up where we're going to talk about capital needs.
yeah. Is that in this deck for today?
It is,
Okay,
but
I
it's
will-
not numbers, but it's a placeholder for it.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Okay. In fact, it's right here. All right, so facility needs. So why are we talking about facility needs when the forecast is really a general fund conversation? It's because, as you well know, and I think it's important to restate every time we get the opportunity, is the district needed permanent improvement funds before the pandemic. The question I get a lot of time is, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you plan for that? Right? So a pretty direct question I think we have to address. The district was levy eminent. We were operating levy eminent. So prior to the pandemic, we needed operating funds. We also had a really high tax effort. So median income to the amount of taxes per capita our community pays, we had a really high tax effort. So to get both operating funds and permanent improvement funds would have been millage that were too high to secure. So the permanent improvement was pushed to the side. Now, also, if we go back a little bit longer, over the past 20 years, our enrollment has declined, both from choice and some declining enrollment, but we had 15 building closures or so in which the board administration was actively managing its footprint. So it's another reason we were able to stay off the ballot, so to speak, because we weren't using as many operating funds to keep legacy buildings going. Now, we're not in that position anymore, where we had an opportunity to consolidate buildings and clusters. So where does that leave us today, and why are we talking about capital? So you know, during the Facilities Commission, the state requires you to set aside some funds. And that took some funds out of our PI fund, and we transfer it every year. That's called the 034 fund. It's a maintenance fund set aside for the purpose of safety support, proactive maintenance on our CLCs. And that generates how much per year? We just talked about that. The 034 generates about $2-point-something million a year. Our most recent average annual spend in that account has been $3.3 million, and we probably need to do more. So we are working some 5 years ago. I think we were pushing close to $20 million in the 034 fund, and it has been steadily reducing. So I can report on what that fund balance is by Monday. We'll figure out what that is. But why is that important to a general fund conversation? It's for the other, it's for the legacy building side of the equation. So every year we're spending about $6.5 million. Now it's not all on just a leaky roof or boilers, but some of it is. $6.5 million is really on capital. The capital could be any fixed asset above 5 years. $6.5 million doesn't meet a true best practice of a capital spend to an overall budget of our size. It needs to be something more substantial than that, and it's normally paired with a permanent improvement account. And I just told you why we didn't have one. Not for the lack of planning, but for the lack of, our PI was committed through a facilities commission some 20 plus years ago, and by the time that operating funds rolled around, we couldn't roll it all in together. We know that we have legacy buildings. We've talked about it, and those estimates are all the way up to $180 million. What do we mean by that? It's not all break fix. It's actually the replacement of some of the buildings that weren't addressed from the previous facilities program. And we also know the reason why that is. We know that when we started that project, it was based on 33,000 kids and higher. When choice legislation, that number was slowly reduced with different enrollment estimates, which means the state funded us at less dollars. We know there's a small balance of funds left over from that project, and we know we'll have access to those funds sometime in the near future being in the next 6 to 12 months, with a partnership with the city once the last segment is closed out. And what I mean by closed out is Garfield High School, all the bills are paid, all the unfinished invoices are reconciled between contractor and school district, and then we can begin that process. But again, we're talking about only one-time funds for a more permanent. So we do have a dilemma, and then open it up for questions. We do have a dilemma in the district of, we need permanent improvement dollars. We need a permanent fixture of those dollars for the future to address either new and or capital projects above and beyond what one-time funds we will have available. Okay, open it. District Administrator Eric McGarvey.
District who?
Eric McGarvey.
He works for us? Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm just curious. So. Please step to the podium. No, I'm just
Hello.
Just kidding.
Just one thing about the 034 fund. Please know that your first building opened in 2006 under that particular construction project with OFCC. So you're now talking, and it was Resnick, and you're now talking a building now that it's now 2022. So those 034 funds that are dedicated to the maintenance of those buildings are now into buildings that are going not as nearly old as legacy buildings, but they still will have items that will need to be addressed that qualify for those funds, as compared to New Garfield, who has not even been open a year yet. I just wanted to bring that as part of the discussion.
No,
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Do you have a sense, Ryan, of how much might be in that fund?
I'm going to look right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So I just, before I forget, because again, I've got, my brain's not functioning today. But I want to make sure that we address another fund that we haven't talked about, and that is, because it's really hazy in my head, and I want to make sure I have a better understanding of this. But there's a fund that the city's attached to that has millions of dollars in it. I think Garfield came in $5 million, I think, under spend or under target, I think, as I recall from Hammond when we were out there some months ago. But that $5 million is a part of a larger pool of dollars that I don't think we necessarily have control over. It's a joint conversation with the city. And so I just sat through the State of the Schools address this week where we talked about the city's support for Akron Public Schools, and we have some serious needs for those dollars. And so, like, that needs to be a part of the public conversation as we move forward, too, because we do have a lot of capital needs. And so we'd love for our partners at the city, to continue their decades-long support of Akron Public Schools and help us find a way to use those dollars in support of our capital needs. That's the first thing I want to make sure we bring some transparency to on Monday. So I'd like there to be a slide about that fund, so we can start the education process, and so we can sort of make this a more public community dialogue. Because what gives me indigestion is I don't feel like enough of the conversation has been public about that fund. And the other thing too is, we also have, I think it was part of the Kimmel report we referenced in the Long-Term Operations Planning Committee about there being ESSER dollars, appropriate ESSER usage for some capital expenditures as well, that I want to bring forward and have that conversation too, because if we're talking about the challenges, and I think this is going to come up at some point, but as we talk about the challenges of passing and levying in this environment, the one thing that I keep coming back to is we know we have ESSER dollars that we can use to address some of those capital expenditures, right? And so, but so far we have not elected to do that, and this board is going to need to take action to ensure that we, spend more time having that conversation, because I know it's not a best practice to spend, and clean me up here, Ryan, but as I recall, I think we've generally said it's not a great best practice to use general fund dollars for capital expenditures. Is that accurate?
That's accurate.
Okay. And so, having said that, we know we have these short-term ESSER funds that we know essentially must be spent by September 2024. We also know that there are supply chain issues that make it important that if we're going to spend those dollars, that we got to get to spending those dollars. And so that pool of money plus the joint city APS account that I'm referencing, like we need to have a conversation about those dollars in that other fund, because if we're talking about the challenges in passing just an operating levy, I didn't say permanent improvement levy, I said operating levy, right? So those are general fund dollars, sort of, right? I mean, so we should be using every available dollar we do know that we have to address capital needs, and not sitting on those dollars like it feels like we're doing, especially with regard to the ESSER conversations that we've had. We also need to make sure that we're appropriately engaging the city around the fund that I've just referenced, that I'm still a little hazy on. Because every time I inquire about it, the response I get back is, not from you all here, but as I ask questions about it, is, well, there's some legalities there, like they can use some of those dollars to satisfy the bond, the bonds, or the debt service, if you will. Well, let's have that conversation, because as a board, we have to understand that better. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm bringing it up here, and something I want to make sure that we at least have a couple of sides to address on Monday, to make sure that board members can ask those questions, because again, it is November of 2022. We now are 23 months out from when the ESSER dollars must be spent, as an example. And with supply chain issues where it could take 6 to 12 to 15, 18 months, we don't have a lot of time to get this figured out, And so I don't want to find it. So the destination I don't want to arrive at is one where we say, okay, we're finally ready to spend those dollars, but now we can't, because that project's going to take 12 months, but we're 6 months out from the dollars must be spent. I don't want to be there, and I think that passing an operating levy is going to be challenging enough, let alone a PI levy. So that's why, hence my urgency around let's speed up the conversation around using the available ESSER dollars in this joint APS city fund to address some of our capital needs, because we may not get another chance to do that, mm-hmm. In the foreseeable future, the next two to 4 years. So again, I just want to make sure that we come back to that. And that's why I asked if we had a slide about facilities, because that was going to jog my memory.
Sure.
So, okay.
Sure. And
Could we also get an understanding of the $150 million in ESSER money, how much of that is encumbered? Or
We'll do an update on that, just because we,
how much is available for, like what Dr. Hall is?
Yeah, so I'm actually glad you used the word encumbered, right? Because there's a difference between encumbered and spent, right? And so the other reason why I bring this up is great point, Dr. Thompson.
and planned.
Right, and planned. And so,
Because-
but plans are subject to change, right?
Correct.
So there are a number of items. Again, it's public knowledge. We're engaged in negotiations right now with the teachers union, right? So pending the outcome of those negotiations, that may impact some of these other items. It may impact the ESSER dollars. So that's why I think it's important to clarify the difference between encumbered versus spent. So anything that's encumbered or planned for, we can back out of that. We can reverse that because those dollars have not been spent yet, and that's why I'm saying the point being about September 2024 is those dollars must be spent, not encumbered by 2024. So I think again, words matter, and so that's why I appreciate your question because I want to make sure that we because a plan is just that, it's a plan, right? There's some great military analogies about plans and what happens when you plan things, but again, you want to make sure that the public understands that the plan does not mean, encumbered does not mean that there's no going back. We can't change course if we need to. If we see the appropriate environmental factors come into play where we need to pivot. So I think the last time I checked, I think we talked about there was a gas gauge, if you will, that showed that of the $90-ish million that were left, that 82 or $83 million were, I think, planned for, to use your vernacular. And that's why in this committee, I've really largely been very vocal about this and the need to have some flexibility and not to get wedded to the word encumbered or planned. Because because capital expenditures, negotiations, these are just two examples of external factors or forces that could cause us to make some big changes to that plan. And so I appreciate your question, Dr. Thompson. I think it's going to be appropriately tied to our conversations.
I do too.
And with that in mind, Ryan, we might also, to help Dr. Hall and the rest of the board, all of us actually, would be that money that's encumbered or planned, how much of that is in personnel. So therefore, to your point, Dr. Hall, would be difficult to pull back unless you're going to go into a RIF. So understand how much of it is actually free. If you follow me, unless you're interested in going into a RIF.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, listen, we can have that conversation too, right? Again, there are external forces out there. Again, I've mentioned two of them already. That there's a high likelihood are going to have an impact on that plan. And so, if we need to have a public conversation about that too, I'm for it as well, right? We also have dollars that are spent. I mean, to your point, we talk about the additional personnel that we've hired, with an eye towards, number one, trying to reduce classroom sizes, right? I mean, but I think it's also important that we recognize that there are trade-offs in the situation, right? So as we interact with the external forces I just articulated, I think it's fair to begin a public dialogue about how those forces potentially impact some of the plans that we currently have in place. I think that's totally fair to do that. I will say that as I think about the capital piece of this as well, that it's without a doubt that we are going to need some additional space to move kids as we think about repairing buildings and repairs that where kids can't be in parts of the building at a time. So, and we don't currently have any swing space in this district, that I'm aware of, and I've been asking this question for months. So I'm not aware of any swing space that we have, sizable swing space that we've got that where we could house an entire school if something catastrophic were to happen, like at a Firestone Park or a Piper. Two schools that are over 100 years old that have a lot of problems there. Miller South being another school, a lot of problems there. If something catastrophic were to happen at one of those three schools, right now in this moment, if we got a phone call, Miller South just imploded, where are those kids going? Firestone Park imploded, where are those kids going? We don't have a plan for that I've seen articulated by anybody. So I think these are all fair things, and I'm thankful that we're having the conversation. I think that we need to keep having more public conversations on these kinds of topics because the public deserves to be a party to it. I'm sorry, Ms. Folk.
Dr. Hall, in regards to your negotiations comment with the teachers, please remember you also are in negotiations with 5 other unions.
Of course.
So therefore, those will have an impact as well going forward as they come to final terms.
Yeah, absolutely. We have what, approximately over 4,000 employees, right? Yeah, so with that large of an employee group, all hard-working, men and women, I think, again, I think it's only fair that we be transparent about the impacts that can potentially have, So, we also hired counselors for every school, right? Because that was an important priority, right? To help to address some mental health stuff. But again, this is going to involve some trade-offs, right? So, as I think about it, it's not in a Maslow's triangle sort of way, but I think about, we need kids to have a roof over their head too, So again, the capital expenditure piece, I'm going to keep talking about that. That's why I referenced that joint city APS fund that is still hazy in my head. So anyway, but I appreciate the conversation.
What's some clarity on that, what's called the LFI account?
LFI account.
So locally funded initiative, and we have begun conversations with the city. I think we're a couple of joint board review meetings into that conversation. So I'm sure we can get an update from the city for the latest by Monday.
Yep.
And then to your question on the 034 account in fiscal 2017, we had about $19 million in that account, and we currently have $13.2 million in that account.
Say it one more time.
So the 034 account in fiscal 2017, we had about $19 million in that account, and we currently have $13.2 million in that account.
We have 13.
Is that money generated from the PI, or is it transferred from general fund?
It's generated from the PI, and then we also get what's called a maintenance equalization payment from the state of Ohio. It's about $500,000, $800,000, something like that. The point being, it's been reduced over that 6 years about $1 million a year based on need. So as the buildings get older, that need will accelerate to Ms. Falk's point. So, but I think we can easily turn that into an information slide and just show a chart. We'll just show a chart of the needs and what kind of expenses, and have a voiceover from our business manager. So.
Yeah, I mean, so again, we have an 034 fund that's got $13.2 million in it, you said, right?
Correct. Now, the nice thing about 034 is it's recurring revenue forever out of the PI, but the need exceeds the recurring revenue.
Yeah, I mean,
so at least it's not.
That's the theme here.
At least it's not the
Right.
LFI,
Yes.
where it's one-time funds and or ESSER. So
That's that point. So we got $13.2 million in 034 fund. We've got, I believe, 13 to 15 million in the LFI.
you're correct.
And
Yep.
then, of course, there's also the ESSER dollars. I think the Kenmore report. I think we talked about $16 million of capital expenditures could ostensibly be used. 16 point. I think it was about $16 million in that report that talked about that we could use ostensibly for an ESSER permissible capital expenditure. So I think that's what the board, I think, needs to. What I would want as a single board member, I'm positing that the board would love to hear more about those 3 disparate funds, so that way we can, again, continue to accelerate our conversations about how we prioritize. Because, one of the things I've said to the superintendent is that, I'm a big advocate, big fan for a long-term operations plan. I think I've been very vocal about that. But I also think that we also need to there are certain parts of that plan that may need to be, and I do believe need to be accelerated. So we do need to be able to be nimble enough so that way we are addressing some of the higher priority items sooner rather than later. So I've been very vocal about that too. So, but I just want to make sure that we're bringing the rest of the board along on that with regard to those conversations as well. So
That sounds good.
Dr. Thompson, did you want to add something else on this topic?
No.
Okay.
I have the same questions you do to understand how to plan.
Yeah.
They'll talk to people.
Yeah. Okay. Roger that.
Great.
Sorry, Ryan, I know we're at time already, but
No, that's great. And you're catching Dr. Hall rhythm here, so it's good. We got you back. we got you back.
yeah. Well, hey, listen, I'm very passionate about this, right? So,
Oh, no, absolutely.
Listen, and it is, and we may not always agree.
If you have
Right,
questions,
on
that
some of
means
these
others
things.
have questions.
Yeah.
And this
And
needs to be a great safe space to ask those questions.
Yeah, and listen, we may not always agree on a path forward, right? And sometimes our viewpoint is not the one that's the prevailing viewpoint. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that we're all team kids here, you know. So
No doubt about it.
yeah.
All right, so we're going to pause. I think we have actually a transition slide here, Andrew. We're going to pause because the majority of the presentation is really around expenses. Post-pandemic reality, what's coming back into perspective and normal. We know our capital needs, our construction, safe, warm, dry. We know those will have a drag on general fund. We know we don't want them to because, as Dr. Hall pointed out, that's the pot of money that educates kids. That's where we try to keep it out of that fund, right? So we do need to go into revenue just briefly because I do think that there are some public misconceptions about revenue with their tax bills going up. I think we have one or two slides about that. This is our revenue. You can see this is state foundation. So this is our state aid. This is the Fair School Funding Plan. And what you see here from fiscal 21 to fiscal 22, there's a lot going on there. So what is it? Very quickly, it's a new school funding formula, but it's also a decline in state and the state reduced, I don't know, $8 million, $5 million in state foundation. And the way that it's constructed, we're funded for 27,000 kids. Remember, it's a funded where educated formula, so we're now funded for our 20,000 plus students, and that's why the numbers look a little bit different there. So the expenses also look a little bit different. To the assumption and question in the very first slide about what are we assuming for the Fair School Funding Plan phase-in. Each year of the forecast, obviously what's in law right now through this school year is in the biennium budget. So we received overall about $3 million the first year, $5 million the second year, for a total of $8 million, and that's in law. We do not anticipate they will reduce that allocation. So that's $8 million additional we receive. What we've assumed hereafter, because of the state's financial condition, is a 3% increase in state aid in each year of the forecast. Now, that does not assume the full phase-in of the Fair School Funding Plan. That doesn't mean that we're not going to advocate for it. It just means when you look over the last 30 to 40 years, we have no history to indicate that the state is going to give us, and upon the Legislative Service Commission, Dr. Hall's simulation, when House Bill 110 was released, it would say, if fully phased in, we would get $33 million additional each year. We have zero evidence and zero practice, nor would it be good assumption budgeting best practice to include a $33 million increase in our annual revenue until we have this next biennium debate and maybe even the next one. So the whole plan was to be phased in over 6 years. Of course, that's what we'll advocate for, but we've included a 3% inflationary. And I can tell you from talking to my colleagues that 3% is a fairly aggressive assumption. Most are not including that. Some are even using 0. So they're staying in the out years. In the future biennium, we will get 0% because they, frankly, have a history that has not been good with the state. So even when times have been good, they haven't received increases in state aid. Now, we're a formula district. That means something, and I think you all know that I've been really close to that conversation, and I take all of that very seriously in saying 3% is a fairly aggressive move, and I sure hope it's greater than that, but I have no history and assumption that it'll exceed that. The state's coffers are about as full as they have ever been. So I am hopeful that the next 2 years of the Fair School Funding Plan will be phased in. I really am. And And if there's a substantial difference in our estimates to actuals come this next November, a year from now, that's when we would update it. Because we won't know any time prior to June, at the end of June. We just won't. I mean, the governor's budget's being put together now. It'll make the House in February, early February. The House will debate it and then turn it over to the Senate. And you better believe that I will be sitting in front of Senate Finance Committee in May and June next year advocating for the implementation of it and representing.
Yeah, that's where I was just making sure I was on the same page, Ryan. So 24 and 25 are the next biennium that we're going to be working out here in February 2023.
That's
Okay.
correct.
Yeah. So we have the dollars for fiscal year 2022 and 2023. What we don't know is if we're going to have the additional expenditure, the additional revenue in 24
Correct.
and 25, right?
Another good question here, though, is maybe a what's at risk question. In fiscal 24 and 25, with us being a formula district, what happens if we decline 100 kids? What happens if we return back to that steadily decline? Now, we flattened out in our enrollment pre-pandemic. But what happens if we decline? If we're a formula district, we won't see those dollars.
And this is where all these things are connected, right? I mean, like, I
Yeah.
know we have these meetings in silos because we have to, because you can't combine everything. But this is where, where we talk about our long-term operations plan. We talk about Miller South. We talk about the STEM middle school. We talk about the things that are not only attractive to kids in Akron, but also attractive to people outside of Akron, right? I think
Right.
last year I saw 24% of the kids in Miller South are not Akron Public School kids. Right, so as we think about how we attract back Akron kids and kids from out of the district, like, this is all connected in that way, right? Because and that's why when we talk about some of the things I keep harping on with relation to the capital expenditure piece, it's why I want to address those things, because when you address those things, it allows you to add capacity to schools like STEM and Miller South, things that we know are attractive offerings to kids who are maybe private school kids in Akron, but also kids who live in the neighboring districts, right? So, to your point, Ryan, like, how do you address? I mean, what's the best way to address this? Well, I'm applying business concepts here. How do we start to recapture some market share, right? And so, what strategies and tactics from education facilities, are we? What's that planning look like? To recapture market share. Like, I don't accept that the kids who are enrolling out of district are just forever gone. I just don't accept that, because I think we've got too many fantastic people and fantastic programmatic offerings and facilities here to just accept that. If that's the reality, like, how then do we start to better tell our story, and how then do we begin to create additional capacity for the crown jewel offerings that we have here as a district? And so that's the kind of thing that, like, I keep pushing on, because I don't know that we've done a great job of articulating that clearly, or planning for it, clearly. And that's not, and me saying that should not be taken as being, that's not me being critical of our administration. It's just saying that because we have a new administrator. I think we've hired 8 new administrators in the last year. Right, so I get that Rome was not built in a day. Like, that team needs time to gel, right? But it's me as a board member saying, hey, our newer team members, administrators that are on board, like, these are the kinds of things that individual board members and I think you find the majority of the board as a whole, these are kind of things that we're worried about and want to see addressed and prioritized, right? So. So again, I appreciate this slide very much, because again, it brings it back around full circle, at least for me, Ryan.
Good. Last couple slides. They are detail heavy, but we have received questions about this slide in particular in the following support slides. Is why did my tax bill go up 12%, and the schools are talking about they didn't see much of an increase in revenue? And that falls back to that House Bill 920 thing that all of us learned about in school finance. So in 2020, we had a reappraisal in Akron, and you see in 2020, we have shown and received an increase of revenue, and that increased to, is that 5% increase? It's a 5% increase in revenue, but it was a 12% increase in reappraisal. And why is that? It's because House Bill 920 reduced millage, and Andrew put this chart together. It's really telling. Just take a look at the 1988 voted millage of 6.5 mils. The effective millage we see today on that's half as much. So we're collecting half of what that original voted millage was in 1988. And then commercial industrials a little bit greater than half at 4.8%. The two most recent levy, and I think this is also a really good history lesson for us as we begin to talk about our future revenue needs. About every 6 years on average, and the last operating levy we had is 2012. So the highest millage we've passed in these last 30 plus 40 years is 8.9 mils. And for our early estimates, we will need every bit of all of those mills in operations, let alone our capital needs. Okay.
Do you think the community and, well, I guess the board understands House Bill 920 pretty well? You got that, or would you need Ryan to?
I think Ryan is. But I'll give Ryan credit. Ryan has shown us a version of that slide a number of times. But I agree with Ms. Autry. I think it's always nice to be reminded. I'm sorry, you had a question?
In the community as well, because House Bill 920 is the driver of everything that is happening in public education funding-wise since 1976.
Correct.
It is the major problem.
Yeah.
And why school districts are continually on the ballot. So maybe even if the board understands it, the community hearing that, teachers hearing that might be beneficial as well.
Yeah, I'll bolster that story up a little bit.
Just,
Yeah.
the basic understanding of what it means and where to come from.
Yeah, the problem is that we don't have enough people in the public watching these board meetings. That's the other problem. So I wish we could find a way to increase the viewership, because then these lessons become even more powerful because you have more people who are watching.
Yes, we will add to that.
So to the seven of you who are watching in the community right now, we appreciate you very much.
Let's jump the next slide, Andrew. That's just more about property values. This is a really interesting study for the board. We put this scenario together, and let's tell you what the assumptions are. We've circled those 3 years because those are our negotiated opening years. So when we settle contracts, those will impact those 3 years circled. That's item number one. Item number two shows a long-term trend out to fiscal 29 of what the books look like. And we've added 2 new lines there. You see ending balance, and then you see ending balance without levies. So the first ending balance is inclusive of a 7.9 mil levy passed in November of 2024, or fiscal 25, that third year of the circle, and you see under the line proposed new levies, you see 11.3 million coming in. That's half year collection of what a 7.9 mil levy is in fiscal 25. So what do the books look like, and what other assumptions are in there? This is assuming benefits, health insurance grows at 5%. That could be a little bit low under the circumstances with some inflation coming back. This includes the 3% foundation revenue average annual per year. And it includes 1.75% increases in wages. So a lot of the assumptions that we kind of threaded together throughout the whole presentation are now in an extended forecast and what it looks like. So without a levy, the district is significantly deficit spending in fiscal 25 to the tune of 20 million and plus and beyond. You can't wait till fiscal 27 when you only have $22 million on the books. You're not making payroll during those years. You have to back it up a couple of years to get that collection. I love having the levy in this slide because you can see it takes 2 full fiscal years to see the full collection and make its impact.
Well, I think the other piece too that's I think would be beneficial as we're walking through this is to ensure that, that board members are following you from a calendar versus fiscal year standpoint.
That's right.
Right? So to your point, if a levy passes hypothetically November of '24, that's fiscal year '25, right? So collections will begin ostensibly, I would say, January of '25.
Correct.
Right? So January of '25. Which is why we only have the 11 million there. That's that half a year, 11 million, and then again fiscal year 26 starting in July 1, 2025, right? So I think sometimes there can be confusion about the fiscal year, calendar year stuff. So we just would call that out, for the rest of the board.
Sure.
So,
And we'll put all of our assumptions on the slide deck as well, so you can see all those. But I think this is a really good place. So this is our last slide. This is what the board will be adopting. So, or something very similar, because we're obviously, that's our job to constantly tweak the numbers. But fiscal 23, you see we've got a balanced budget this year. You see that revenue surplus or deficit's about $4.5 million, closing balance at $108 million. You can see with the current 1.75s, current fiscal 23 and 24s when ESSER runs out, that's why we've shaded that area. You see the return of the expense from $342 million to $364 million. It's where we keep those $10 million of ESSER initiatives into the books. But that's also the same time we start to deficit spend at a pretty decent trend. So this is what we will file with ODE, but it's still really good to run all those other scenarios. And what's not in here is if we take additional dollars in capital. What's not in here is any bargaining unit settlements, which we know are pretty imminent, and any other ESSER one-time uses. So,
and then payroll is about $25 million a month.
yes.
So about $12 million every 2 weeks.
Yep.
Okay. Which reminds me, we've got to come back to the cash reserve policy.
I agree. And
so
in your board packet for either this finance committee or the last one, I included the most recent cash balance white paper study that a group of treasurers put together. All right, any other questions? How about any other, the feedback and questions were wonderful, so we'll add a lot to that presentation for the board on Monday.
Do you have any kind of spreadsheet or Excel spreadsheet that would allow you to play with numbers and show the impact on the 5-year forecast?
Yes.
That might be powerful for people to see, what does 1% mean? Because it doesn't seem like it should be a lot, but it is.
Yeah.
Well, I think to that point, that's a tool that we want to use in the Monday board meeting. I think that the power in that is, if the dashboard, so for example, oftentimes there's software, you make the changes and you get the circle of death while you're waiting for it to load. Yeah. If that's the case, I would say let's do screenshots. So let's put the numbers in. And then
we've run just about every single scenario, so we can easily screenshot it, but we do have...
But if it's fast enough, you could just do it real time.
We do have robust tools where we can simulate a lot of different things.
Okay, all right. So we should. Okay, all right. So we should.
We'll do screenshots, but
all right.
In a sense, we can generate those the day of or right before.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Madam Chair.
Any other points?
All right. Thank you so much. Thanks, Pete, in the booth.
All right.